We're going to continue where we left off on theme, although looking at the next century of time today. So we're going to be looking up to the end of the end of the 3rd century. Things take a really drastic turn, as we're going to see in our next lecture, when Christianity becomes legal and no longer persecuted. And then the sorts of developments that happen are of a different nature. So today's lecture is going to kind of pick up and develop a lot of things we looked at last time, but just with different figures and different places. And then our next lecture will look at sort of the huge cataclysm of Constantine's legalization of Christianity. So we're going to be looking at heresies. We're going to introduce, so that's continuing last time. We're going to introduce schisms as distinct from heresies, and we're going to look at continued persecutions in the 3rd century. I mentioned last week a handful of the big players in 2nd century and early 3rd century theology. Just wanted to show you those names again because we're going to briefly glance at seeing their names here and there. If you remember, last time we ended at looking at what were the sort of responses and modes of response that the great teachers of the early church developed in the face of contradictory claims from within in-house, right? Remember, we looked at these heresies which tried to either add or take away from sort of traditional Christian theology, and that these figures and others developed these responses of saying, well, no, how do we sort of make a public, earnest appeal that our version of Christianity is in fact more credible and more credibly grounded on Jesus Christ himself? And last week we looked at 2 of those responses. One was argumentation from Scripture. The other was the development of the idea of apostolic succession, and that the continuity of leadership is one of the guarantors of the continuity of the tradition. Not to say that it doesn't sometimes take different words or in different areas, different points are emphasized, but that there's at least some sort of corralling force provided by ministers who succeeded one another. So those were the first 2 responses. We're going to continue on looking at their responses, at the great responses that really give shape to the teaching and self-understanding of the church. I was thinking about our lecture this morning as I was brushing my teeth, and I realized, for a history class, we're going to look at a lot at ideas and differences of ideas, and that's not often what we think of when we think of history. Usually we think chiefly of kind of material history, of like great leaders, great figures, economics, sociology, and of course we're touching on some of those things. But I am spending a decent amount of time on ideas, and I think that's justified, partly because that's more where my training is, and that's just kind of what I'm inclined towards. But also because if you were to give, say, the history of Oxford University, you couldn't tell that history without telling the history of the currents of ideas that have flowed through, because it's an institution founded on ideas. And the church is not founded on ideas in the same way that a university is, but the teaching and message of its founder, the ideas within it, are an integral part of the constitution of the organization. So that's why we're spending so much time on the ideas as they're developing within the church, because they are the thing around which so much of the church's life has orbited around and paid attention to. So that's just an apologia for what we're doing these 2 lectures. So the 3rd response that the great teachers and sort of the tradents of the church develop is this idea of Catholicity. We kind of used different verbiage in the last 2 lectures for traditional Christianity, mainstream Christianity, inherited Christianity, and I intentionally was using vague terminology because the church only had vague terminology to begin with, and they actually had to develop a vocabulary to sort of say, okay, what is the faith that St. Peter and St. Paul and all of our successors that we all believe, and how do we distinguish that as opposed to what Marcion is teaching over here, or what the Ebionites are saying over there. And one of the things that emerged is this word Catholic. So these days when you hear the word Catholic, we think first of all Roman Catholic, right? We think all those folks who are under communion under the Bishop of Rome, the Pope of Rome. That meaning of the word Catholic is unique to our millennium, which in church terms means it's kind of new. And by millennium I mean the last 1,000 years, not the 3rd millennium. But the word Catholic originally arose and was a defining adjective in the early church with a different meaning, and that's what we're going to look at. So the word means according to the whole. So it's a compound word from kata, I mean, if you know your Greek, according to, if followed by an accusative, right? No Greek students here who caught the anyways. And then holos, meaning whole, and so it's according to the whole. So the idea of the word Catholic is that you're saying it's actually it's a word that has built in a circular argument intentionally. It's saying we believe whatever everyone else believes. That there's this sort of comprehensiveness to, well, what did St. Peter believe? Well, that's what we believe. What did the bishop in Antioch 2 generations after him believe? Hey, according to everybody, that's what we believe. And even though the word is not found in the Bible, you can't find the word Catholic, the principle is actually embedded still within. So for instance, Paul, when he writes to 1 Corinthians, one of the ways he sort of actually urges a practice on them is he says, if anyone in Corinth is inclined to be contentious, we have no such practice, nor do the churches of God. Right? So Paul's traveling through all the churches, and he can say, look, nobody else is doing this, which means you must be wrong. Right? It's this sort of appeal to the consensus of the whole. That which is believed and practiced, right, those two things going together, by all other Christians around the world. So that's what the word Catholic meant. Indeed, still means as a sort of technical usage in its early church. And we see this word latched onto, I think I have a slide. Yeah, so Polycarp, remember we've mentioned him, he was the one who, when he was set on fire alive, it said he looked like baked bread. Remember that guy we read about? So Polycarp, he's the one, let me see here, who uses it first. I don't have it on there. But Polycarp is the one who uses it second. I forget who uses it first. But right away, in the mid-2nd century, mid-100s, this word Catholic becomes a very useful shorthand way for who you're identifying with. Are you with this kind of upstart, intriguing, exciting Marcionism that's brand new? Or are you part of the sort of traditional faith as it's been handed down? And one of the words they sort of used very quickly was, no, I'm a Catholic Christian. And so it's interesting to think for all of us, for all of you who are a member of Protestant churches, you know, we trace our church history back through that kind of genetic family tree to the one trunk. That one trunk was very proud of the name Catholic. And indeed, scholars within every Protestant tradition are often trying to reclaim and repristinate it for themselves to say, no, the Methodists, the Lutherans, we participate in the Catholic faith. Sometimes you'll see it distinguished with a little c instead of a capital C as a way to distinguish, look, I'm not trying to pretend that we're Roman Catholic. Yeah.
So the word universal is not quite Catholic.
Well, so they're very similar in meaning, right? Because by universal, you're appealing to sort of what else is done everywhere else. So sort of if we think of like semantic footprints, their range of meanings overlap substantially. But Catholic has taken on sort of it has a sort of, whereas you use the word universal in many different contexts, Catholic is sort of such a unique churchy word that it has its own sort of subtle currency and history, which is why it's still in the creeds today, in most translations. So the word is used to distinguish from those who choose their own made-up path. Remember that was the definition of heresy, to choose. So to say I'm a Catholic Christian says I'm not going to choose what I believe. I'm going to rely on what the church has handed down. Right? There was a very traditional impulse very early on, as we're going to keep unpacking. Did I see a question here in the middle? No? Okay. So here's a definition of Catholic. Oh, no clicker. There you go. Cyril of Jerusalem. So here we're looking actually a bit beyond our window of today, but he gives us a very nice definition, so I've included it. If the church is called Catholic, then it's because it extends over all the world. There's a geographic reference from one end of the earth to the other, and because it teaches universally and completely one and all the doctrines that ought to come to human knowledge, that there's actually this claim of the fullness of religious knowledge concerning things visible and invisible, things like God. It's also called Catholic because it brings into subjection to godliness the whole race of humankind. So Cyril's saying that unlike sort of, if you say Jewish, which implies only one blood type, he's saying it's Catholic in that it's for all people and possesses in itself every form of virtue that's named. So Cyril's just riffing here, right? He's just kind of like going, unpacking, shredding on his axe. But he's unpacking the definition of Catholic in a sermon. But he's explaining it to his people as the word came to be developed, but really existed in earlier times. So Polycarp, mid-2nd century, that's when the word comes into currency. Here we go. So this is from the martyrdom of Polycarp. So this document was written towards the end of the 2nd century, but it's referencing the events of his martyrdom in the 2nd century. The Church of God, which sojourns at Smyrna, in modern-day Turkey, to the Church of God sojourning in Philomelium, and to the congregations of the Holy and Catholic Church in every place. So just you can see the sort of primary text usage of the word. It's not just an appeal to a living consensus, like what does everyone agree on now, but to a consensus across time, i.e. the importance of tradition. It's G.K. Chesterton, who coined that wonderful phrase, tradition is the democracy of the dead. Isn't that good? That it's letting the dead vote on what we say and do and believe. So tradition is very important in the early church. And again, this is a biblical concept. It wasn't sort of like there was some... one of the sort of false caricatures which I really regret in academic writing about the early church is this idea that sort of the earliest church, they were just sort of these free-spirited hippies, and then the second generation were like, we need to have bylaws and constitution, and kind of hammers it down with rigidness. We see in the scriptures, and not just the late scriptures, the latter letters of Paul, the letters to Timothy, are of a later date, and some of those black and white portrayals will sometimes say, look, we see it in the later letters. We see Paul's sort of emphasis on tradition, and we do. Paul will actually say to Timothy, use the exact words that I passed down to you, right? I mean, you couldn't be more traditional. But even in his earliest letters, 2 Thessalonians is the earliest written letter in the New Testament, because it probably came before 1 Thessalonians. It's just shorter, and that's why it got put after, and we call it 2 Thessalonians. Did you know that the books of the New Testament are arranged by length? It's as banal as that. That's why it goes Romans, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, because they're just in descending order of length. But they did the word count wrong on Galatians, because it's one out of... Anyways, okay. So this is the earliest letter. So then, brothers, so this is written in the mid to late 40s, right? So within 15 or so years of Jesus' death. Brothers, stand firm and hold to the traditions that you were taught by us. Who is us? Apostles. Either by our spoken word or by our letter, right? So Paul is referencing right away traditions. And then 1 Corinthians, also a very early book, early 50s. Now I commend you because you remember me in everything and maintain the traditions. So he's not just passing them on, he's approving their current maintenance of them, meaning they were already well established, even as I delivered them to you. The word, it's unfortunate that here in English we have two different words, tradition and deliver, because the Greek word for deliver is just the verb for tradition. So if you want to do a really wooden translation, you could say, maintain the traditions even as I traditioned them to you. And now those were technical terms received from the heritage of Jewish teachers like Gamaliel, who Paul studied under, who used that language to talk about the maintenance of the faith. So from the very earliest days, the church was very traditional, and that's part of what then claimed the name Catholic when that word emerged. Here's just another riff on this word Catholic. I'm giving several of these because it's a bit of reprogramming to not just hear Roman Catholic. And so let me read this. So this is Pacian of Barcelona, a 4th century church, a bishop. During the time of the apostles, you will say, no one used to be called Catholic. So interestingly, in his time, people are sort of pushing against the word. And they're like, well, I don't see the word Catholic in the Bible. So Pacian's having to argue against that. He's like, yeah, I admit it. We don't see the word in the Bible. And the apostles themselves didn't use the word Catholic. So be it. Conceded out of the gate. It may have been so. I allow you even that. But when, after the apostles, heresies had appeared and were striving under various names to tear to pieces and split apart the dove and the queen of God, which is the church. The dove and the queen of God is the church. Riffing off of this bridal imagery in Ephesians 5, did not the apostolic people require a name of their own by which they would mark the unity of an uncorrupted people? Here, not meaning that they were without fault, but that their theology was handed down without corruption. So this is a great epitome of the history and development of the word Catholic. The people needed a name. They required a name to distinguish themselves from the various heretical groups who would say, we are Christians. And the church had to say, okay, this is confusing. You're saying you're Christian, but then you're teaching there's 30 archons through which the pleroma of the demiurge allows you to, it's like, that's not what we believe. So they took the name Catholic. So that was the thing. And then sort of part and parcel with taking a name was developing what came to be called a rule of faith. You'll see it in Latin sometimes, regula fide, Rule meaning the sense of not rule as in, meaning rule like a measuring rod, like it's sometimes called the canon of faith. What would be a test that you could put to something to sort of sniff out, is it really the Christian faith or not? Because the people needed, things weren't printed and bound in books as nicely as we have them here and accessed by an encyclopedia to kind of put everything in neat categories. People were just living their Christian lives, and some wandering missionary would come and he'd say, brothers, I've got some teaching. And you'd be like, okay, how do we know if this is actually from an apostle or not? Because remember, the New Testament documents are still circulating. For instance, you could be a church in Cappadocia in northern Turkey, and maybe as late as the early 3rd century, get a letter and say, this is a sermon to the Hebrews by Paul or one of his students. And you'd be like, okay, never heard this letter before. But what's interesting is the church, despite how traditional they weren't closed-minded out of the gate. I sent you a video lecture, if you got a chance to see it, by John Baer, who makes this point really well. The church was actually massively receptive because they had a stable base of tradition. They could receive new things and be discerning, but they needed tools to be discerning with. So when a letter arrives and says, this gospel was written by Thomas, you'd be like, well, Thomas is one of our beloved apostles. Let's give it a read. And how would you know not to just slide that into your book of books that you read on a Sunday morning? Well, you needed a rule of faith. So this phrase, rule of faith, emerges quite early on in the mid to late 2nd century. Irenaeus, in his massive book Against the Heresies, Adversus Heresis, he says of heretics that not one of them but feels no shame in preaching himself and thus depraving the rule of faith. So Irenaeus doesn't explain exactly what he calls a canon. He doesn't explain exactly what he means by that, but what we see how it functions is the true and sound preaching of the church, which offers to the whole world one and the same way of salvation. So a rule of faith, we know what it does. It's the thing you can use to test what's true from what's false. But what is the rule of faith? And he gives this great picture. So Irenaeus says, every chapter in the Bible is like a mosaic tile. And if you are a wise artist and you know how to make the mosaic that is supposed to be made, you can take each of those pieces and make a glorious portrait of Jesus Christ with the mosaic tiles. But it is of the nature of mosaic tiles that you could rearrange them. And in fact, someone could come along and take those tiles and create a picture of a fox and say, here, O Christians, is your king. Right? And he's saying, well, what's the difference? Like, how do we know what the pattern is by which the tiles are to be rearranged? Because the heretics were actually using the scriptures. They were saying, oh, but look at this verse in Proverbs chapter 8. Look at this verse in Psalm 45. And we're going to look at those next lecture. But they were taking scriptures and they were putting them in the wrong place. And Irenaeus says, well, how do we know it's not the picture that's supposed to be drawn? And this leads actually really to early creedal development. If you've ever wondered where did the creeds come from, it wasn't that there was some committee being like, we should have a pithy summary just to be able to put on a board somewhere, a mission statement. They developed as one of the earliest forms of distinguishing the faith. So if someone says that Jesus didn't really raise from the dead, if you knew your creed, you could say, wait a second, we always confess he rose from the dead. So whatever you're saying, it must be wrong. It doesn't. I have a rule of faith, a distinguishing test, and it misses, right? In the very least, it's not what was handed to us, right? Now, you philosophers may try and say, oh no, but objectively, it's more meritorious. Well, I leave that to the believers and the unbelievers to disagree on. But in the very least, it can be agreed on. It wasn't the faith that was received. The idea of creeds is actually, again, not rooted and evidenced in the New Testament. The scholars of creeds say that the earliest creedal fragment is this: Jesus is Lord. So that's one citation of it, but you see this in different versions all throughout the New Testament. And when you see things sort of pop up in different places, but in a sort of stereotyped language, it implies it just exists as a phrase, and indeed as a creedal phrase to say, Jesus is Lord. And this is actually full of meaning. How many of you have ever opened a Bible and you've seen the word Lord written in all capital letters? You ever seen that? Yeah. Do you know why they do that? So it's used that in the Hebrew Scriptures, the name of God was considered so holy that when you saw the name of God, you wouldn't dare pronounce it out loud. You would instead say Adonai, which is the word for Lord. So you'd be reading, and so you would actually not read the word on the page, but all your listeners would know, the word on the page must be Yahweh, because he said the word Adonai. And Adonai was translated into Greek, Kyrios, which is Lord. And so to say Jesus is Lord has a double entendre of both Jesus is master, the simple meaning of the word Lord, but also this idea of saying Jesus is Yahweh, right? There was that connection of the Jewish origins of Christianity. So that's one of the earliest creeds. We see another called a creedal fragment in the 15th chapter of 1 Corinthians. Paul writes, I delivered, see that word? Tradition, right? Again, paradidomi. I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received. So here's what's interesting. Paul is an apostle, right? He has this Damascus Road experience. What happens the moment after he sees the light on the road to Damascus? Jesus talks to him, and then what happens after that? He goes and stays at the house of one whose name is just blanked on me. What's the guy's name? Ananias. Thank you. Yeah, it's Ananias. He meets Ananias, who then he hangs out with for 3 days before getting his eyes healed, and then it says he gets baptized. So even Paul received from others aspects of the faith. That Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, which is the Aramaic name for Peter, then to the 12. If any of you attend a church where the Apostles' Creed is part of the liturgy, you recognize this phrase, right? Died, buried, actually sort of drilling home the fact he was really dead, died, buried, raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures. That's still a part of creedal language. So we can actually trace through these sort of fragmentary glimpses from 1 Corinthians through to Justin Martyr in the mid-2nd century, the birth of what we now call the Apostles' Creed. Yeah.
Sorry.
No.
It's always struck me that Paul, bingo, got it all.
Yeah.
Like quick dose.
Yeah.
How do you come to that?
Yeah, so a secular scholar would just say he was just one of these sort of incredible freak geniuses like a Shakespeare or an Einstein or something. A Christian scholar would say God himself gave to Paul divine knowledge to be able to understand these things. Yeah. Right. And a lot of it, though, too, is I think so much of what we see in Paul's writings is it's not, I don't think the way God usually works in the Christian tradition is some sort of like brain download. It's always, I think, actually the guidance and the perfecting of what is being brought to the table by the gifts he gave you by nature. The way I understand Paul's writings is he has this immense knowledge of the Scriptures and a great zeal for God. And then he meets Jesus in a mystical vision of light, and Jesus says, "Why are you persecuting me?" And Paul's like, "I was killing Stephen. Like, I wasn't persecuting you. Who are you?" You know. But all of a sudden, he's met with the fact that Christ exists and is still alive and is real. And so much of Paul's writing, I think, is sort of in the face of this encounter. E.P. Sanders the great Jesus scholar, uses the memorable, Paul scholar, the very memorable phrase. Paul, when he writes, if you're familiar with Paul's letters, he uses language like in Romans 7 about like there's this sort of human dilemma, and here's the solution is Jesus. And that's how it's presented logically. But in Paul's life, it seems to be he's presented with the solution first, which then totally makes him rethink what the dilemma was. So he thought the dilemma was, we've got to keep Torah with a zeal like the Maccabees had, right? And then he meets Jesus, like, oh no, the dilemma was death is the dilemma. Like sin is he kind of reframes everything. And so he kind of rethinks everything he knows about God from the Old Testament through the lens of Christ. And I think then, guided by the Holy Spirit, he produced, his writings that have shaped the church ever since. So which is not to say I do believe confessionally they are inspired by God, but I think he used Paul's experience to bring it out. Yeah. No, it's a good tangent. So we can trace what we could call a proto-Apostles' Creed. They began as baptismal creeds in the 2nd century. And I'm going to end our time together with a little work of historical fiction, which I think is very real, that sort of highlights this. But what would happen is you would come to be baptized and you had to confess publicly what you believed before you got baptized. So you would say, I believe in God, I believe in Jesus, I believe he died, I believe he rose again, I believe in the Holy Spirit. And they would say, okay, well now we will baptize you into that reality. You know. And so Justin Martyr, for instance, we just saw that name at our list of fathers in the mid-2nd century. He records, we worship the creator of the universe and Jesus Christ, the Son of God and first begotten of all creation, who was born through the Virgin and became passible man and was crucified under Pontius Pilate and died and rose again from the dead and ascended to heaven. So this is in his dialogue with Trypho the Jew, chapter 85. What does that sound like? The Apostles' Creed, right? So we see the Apostles' Creed being formed in the belly, right, of the early and mid-2nd century. I mean, actually right there in Corinthians in the very 50s. It doesn't take the exact word-for-word form that we know it in today until the early 5th century. But I would say, but sometimes if you heard that, you'd think, wait, the creed originated in the 5th century. That would be a false statement. That's, I mean, in terms of word-for-word, precise, identical with what we have now. Actually, I think there was one word added in the 8th century, now that I think about it, in terms of what we have exactly now. But it was mostly there in the 5th century. But the beating heart of it, anyone who would say this doesn't sound like the Apostles' Creed just isn't listening. This is the Apostles' Creed in early, nascent, kind of a bit more rough and ready form. But it's this creedal formulation that becomes the plumb line in the midst of lots of diverging stories about Christianity and pseudo-authored documents kind of floating around, to be able to say, well, Paul would never have said that Jesus didn't die or that he wasn't raised, because that's part of our inherited confession, our inherited creed. Yeah.
Is this a Jewish tradition? I mean, in the Old Testament, whenever a prophet would declare, did he go through all this sifting
Oh, yeah, that's actually a really good analogy. So yeah, it is the case in Judaism that we see the revelation from Sinai in successive layers of epitomization, of being distilled. And even the laws, like, that you see them sort of in the reforms of the great kings like Josiah and Hezekiah, that they wouldn't say, okay, we got to keep all 98 of these bullet points for our festival. They'd say, these are the 3 biggies. You know, they kind of boil it down. And then you see it in Judaism of the 1st century BC, the Targumim we mentioned, them really kind of summarizing, like, if you keep these 10, you're basically keeping the 90, you know, like how it would work. So yeah, so we do see sort of distillation as a way of sort of, because most folk can't remember 100 rules, you know, but an Apostles' Creed of 12 sentences, you know, many of you may have it memorized, you know, so there was a sort of functional aspect of that. So yeah, so the final form, as we know, I do think there was one word, I forget, I want to say the phrase, he descended to the dead, was one of the later additions. I want to say that actually didn't get added to the 8th century, which isn't to say he didn't descend to the dead, but in terms of that exact verbiage entering a sort of formalized creed, it was the late 4th century. So the Apostles' Creed becomes the shared, that's huge, clear, Catholic rule of faith. I hope this sentence means a lot more now than it would have half an hour ago, right? Catholic rule of faith. So when we talk about sort of this developing of Catholicity, the development of that name to stick on it, and then the content by which it can be judged as a creed. These are all things we're all churning about in the sort of mid to late 2nd century, and really taking sort of, we see them in full effect. The reason in some ways this belongs to last lecture, but we see it then functioning in the midst of the 3rd century, when new heresies and things arrive. There's this a creed ready-made in that hand to be able to utilize for teaching. So we see it was the challenge of heresies that actually prompted, because those are the several responses now finished, that actually prompted the early church to clarify and strengthen itself for the future. So that was why I began last lecture talking about all things work together for the good of those who love God. St. Paul said it from the beginning, and it turned out to be true in the case of heresies for church history. So I want to change gears to something completely different. But before I do, any questions about that development of Catholicity or the rule of faith or all that, the way they responded to the earliest heresies? Okay. Gonna have some fun right now. Why did the Romans hate and persecute the Christians? We looked at some of the persecutions last time. Some of the worst came in this century. So it raises the question, why were they so hated? I mean, what did they do, right? These Christians just believed different stuff, right? Well, let's look at that. So, first of all, if we recreate the religious setting of the church under the Roman Empire, the pre-Christian Roman Empire, so from the time of Christ up until the year 311. When we recreate the religious setting, and we look at what Roman religion was constituted of, we have a lot of sources to understand it. We have Plutarch, Tacitus, Josephus, half of the Loeb Library, right? It gives us these glimpses into Roman religion. By the way, one of the things I'm always surprised by, anytime I read a 1st, 2nd, or 3rd century document or before, is how instinctively religious everybody was, right? That it's hard to imagine on this side of the Enlightenment that even the most sort of august senators would be like, well, I need to have this go well, so I'm going to go to the shrine first thing in the morning and make a sacrifice. Like just this instinctive religious impulse. There was 2 layers to Roman religion. The first was obeisance to the empire cult, and then the second was the promulgation of household and regional deities. So these are 2 layers. And the inherited Greek pantheon kind of sometimes fell in between these two. Like sometimes a Greek god would be kind of picked up and lionized as a part of a Roman idea, and then sometimes they were just sort of regional gods. So there was these sort of 2 layers in which these functioned, and I'm going to say more about that. So the first about empire cult. Rome was a heavy state, meaning that its emblems and its sort of ways of honoring it were thick and frequent. Allegiance to Rome was of primary importance, and this was demonstrated by obeisance to the imperial cult, honoring the godlike emperor, like his symbols. And think about the way we have like a flag code, right, for the treatment of flags. It was like that, except way more intense and with more symbols, like the coins and I mean, actually, even today in England, it's illegal to mark a coin because it's the Queen's face, right? Is it illegal for American currency? Can you mark? Is there a punishment for? There is for marking like dollar bills. Okay, I didn't know that. Okay, so same thing, right?
If you score the edge of a coin.
Okay, yeah. So in many ways, we actually have this. There may be some of them are less thickly entrenched in our culture, but we have some point of reference, right? That when you see someone stomping on a flag, you're like, maybe technically you can do that, but like, can you find some better way to communicate what you're trying to communicate, right? There was honoring the Roman pantheon, which actually began to be renamed according to the emperors. So they would take Mars and rename him Augustus after Caesar Augustus, right? It was like, well, nice move, Augustus. Giving financial gifts to the emperor temples, attending civic events. These were all part of like a patriotic duty, and they had religious overtones, which again, in a nation founded by constitutionally with state and church separated, it's hard to imagine this, but it's not so hard because we have pictures from other eras, right? So these are, always images were like, whoa. But I mean, look at North Korea, look at Nazi Germany, this idea of sort of religious ideas and like the sort of the structures of religion kind of underwriting and veining the governmental structures, right? We see, these are examples of thick states, right? North Korea, Germany, where it's like, if you're not on board, you are out, right? I mean, the pressure that some of the elderly old German folks talk about to join the Hitler Jugend, it meant if you even balked, you were unpatriotic, you were morally corrupt. I mean, there was this sort of thick religious-like pressure to get on board with what the state is doing. I think these are good pictures of Rome, ancient Rome. The second layer, so there's that imperial honoring, and then the second layer was your household gods. Sometimes these were local deities specific to the city and the state-sponsored shrine that they had. Sometimes they would be sort of maybe idols, statues inherited from your ancestry, maybe statues that were emblematic of your ancestors, like a little statue that you said was your grandfather and it was on the family shrine. All the Roman villas at that time had these little sort of worship shrines built into them. And it was part of the culture that you had to have some. We talked about a few times ago that Socrates was killed because he didn't have any. He was such a weirdo that he didn't have household gods. Like, that was his problem in the eyes of the people who killed him. There was also some mystery cults that were sort of upsurgently popular beginning in the 1st century that had this sort of secret club idea. So that's kind of the religious backdrop. And then when someone doesn't fit into that picture, this is the slide I'm excited about. Right? So think what you want. I'm not trying to propagate one view of Colin Kaepernick or another, but look at what's happened in the national scene about one man taking a knee for 2 minutes of his life once a week, right? I mean, like, when we talk about, we live still in a symbolic age. If you do things outside of the symbol system that the nation has said, this is what binds us together, boom, right? I mean, how many people have seen Nikes burned, right, even just lately? I made this slide 2 years ago, and it's, this is still going on. So I actually think we actually can understand, why would people hate the Christians? Why do people hate Colin Kaepernick? Right? He's not going along with the program that says, I'm on our team of our empire. Yeah. So multiply the national response to Colin Kaepernick here 5-fold and make it a religious issue. I mean, just imagine, right? Now you can actually kind of understand, why would someone want to just take a knife to the throat of a Christian? Because they're just corrupting the whole system, right? So this led to outrageous slander, which then further provoked persecution. So in the same way we saw, tragically in Hitler's Germany, sort of slanders against the Jewish people, which actually were the impetus for violent outbreaks, because it's sort of what you start calling people is how you start thinking, makes how you start acting. So when you get stuff like this was a late 2nd century Roman writer, Minucius Felix, writing to a guy named Octavius. And he writes this. I can't even read all this because it's so gross, but you can read the slide later. Talking about Christians, they lick up, they say that they sacrifice children, young children, every time they get together, and they lick up its blood, and they divide its limbs. By this victim, they are pledged together. With this consciousness of wickedness, they're covenanted to mutual silence. Such sacred rites as these are more foul than any sacrileges, by which he means failure to honor the Roman gods. And of their banqueting, it's well known, all men speak of it everywhere. Even the speech of our Sertengian testifies to it. On a solemn day they assemble, and people of every sex and age, and thereafter much feasting, the fellowship's grown warm. The fervor of incestuous lust has grown hot with drunkenness. A dog that's been tied to, okay, I'm skipping. It's just like, bleh. But if you read that stuff, and then you meet someone who says he's a Christian, you're like, dude, I'm not even shaking your hand, right? And that was sort of like, and then you can just imagine what that does when, when you look at world history, it's always the 17 to 25-year-olds causing the trouble. Think about the French Revolution, it's put that in the hands of an angry 17-year-old, well, he's going to go knife some guy. So, yeah.
Do you think this has any influence on traditional Jews not accepting Jesus because of not wanting to be?
It certainly put up a barrier for anyone to want to become a Christian because of the shunning. That's true. But what's interesting is we actually saw this in Hitler's Germany and Germany before, right? Making up lies about people to try and have them be a hated group. Yeah.
It seemed like the Jews that are our forefathers, for sure, learned how to live with the system.
Yeah. Well, so that's interesting. So, of course, sometimes they didn't live with the system. The Maccabean revolt in the 160s BC being a sort of glaring example of like the empire has stepped too far. Like you put your imperial symbol inside the temple, it's war. You know what I mean? And the Maccabees were valorized as being like the purest-hearted Jews of all time in Jesus' day. So they had their limits too of what sort of one stuff you couldn't accept. Yeah. Anyone read any E.E. Cummings fans in the house? The poet E.E. Cummings. I sing of Olaf, glad and big, right? So, 2 types of persecution. At all times, there's a sort of general pervading atmosphere of shunning from local markets, guilds, and guilds were everything. In the absence of regulatory structures for the marketplace, like we have, like the EPA saying, don't put all your oil in the water supply, guilds is what sort of kept the market churning. So to not be in those seems like a very small thing. It's like, oh, boo-hoo, you can't be in the Weavers Guild. Well, it's like, well, good luck feeding your family. Like, good luck, you know what I mean? Like, so these were actually, even though they're soft persecutions, sociologically, they're still rough on the ground, and a general disenfranchising of those who called themselves Christians. But then sometimes there were these violent pogroms and martial executions. So I make this distinction because sometimes I feel like every 5 years I see some piece in like the New York Times or something saying, Historian says that blank persecution, Decian, Neronian, Domitian, wasn't as bad as the Christians have always said it was. And it's like, okay, so like, can you find hard evidence for more than a couple dozen graves? I mean, yeah, but what can you find hard evidence? I mean, sometimes I think they're arguing too hard, but even that misses the point of a general disenfranchising. So yeah, two types of persecution. So the Decian persecution, I'm not going to read this whole quote. It's more of the same what we looked at last time, like limbs being cut off, people being asked to deny Christ and refusing and being tortured brutally, and then seized and suffering decapitation. The memories of their deaths become special. It's in the early 200s we see Tertullian say, when a martyr dies, that's his true birthday. Right? This idea that like actually then his real life with God has sort of begun in a more fulsome way. And so the death dates, you look on when you think about like, oh, today's the feast day of St. Francis of Assisi, or today is the feast of St. Ignatius of Antioch, who we looked at, who was the one who said, if I am killed in the arena, I may become truly human. I mean, that's the Ignatius. The dates they were killed were kept in remembrance, and each year as they rolled around, the community of disciples of whom that martyr was a member would remember as a kind of a rallying point, like, remember, on this day, Fabian was killed, and we remember his memory, and we stand for the faith he stood for, right? Similar to how memorial days, civil memorial days were, they exist now, are actually an imitation of the church festivals, right? Like a Veterans Day or something. That's the same idea. Like on this day, we remember when these martyrdoms happened. The Decian persecution was particularly severe. This is a narrative from Fox's Book of Martyrs, which is a late and half-reliable source. He sort of is embellishing it, but he does rely on a lot of primary sources, and I should actually get a better source for this quote, but because the Decian is one of those ones. There's two really big ones. The Decian in the 3rd century, the Decian, and then Diocletian. Diocletian's the worst of all. It's sort of like it's always darkest just before the morning. Diocletian was in 303. 10 years later, Christianity would be legal forever, but, well, almost forever. Okay, so this would actually bring us to the problem of the lapsi. Who are they? You'll have to come back after the break. So, lapsi, those of you sort of who like seeing the connections between the languages, is where we get the word lapsed, right, as in lapsed Catholic. So the problem of the lapsi, really the question of the lapsi centers around the pastoral response of two people, Cyprian of Carthage and the person who disagreed with him, Novatian. So Cyprian, when we look at the sort of great teachers of the church, we see this burst of teaching and writing in the mid and to late 2nd century, those list of fathers we began with, whose lives trickle into the early 3rd century. There's really only just one sort of really bright light in the midst of the 3rd century, and that's Cyprian of Carthage. We see then a whole slew of fathers come in the early 4th century, but he kind of dominates the scene in the mid-3rd century. His antagonist was Novatian. Look, interestingly, they lived the exact same time period, kind of like dueling sort of epic comic book nemesis. But it's Novatian who created the first major schism. I'm going to define that word in just a second. And he created it because he was discontent with the Catholic response. So again, hopefully these sentences have a richer meaning from what we've already looked at. The response that the rest of the churches had in the face of the lapsi. So now let me that was the overview, now let me get into the details. So schism is to break away from the Catholic Church without adopting heretical doctrine. Okay? So if you are Marcion and you say, there's actually two gods, you change the doctrine, you're a heresy. But if you say, hey, I believe everything that the church teaches, but in terms of how you guys are living your life, whatever, various reasons, we need to be a separate group from you. And this sort of separation, but not of doctrinal dispute, but at the level of fellowship and the practices of fellowship. So like, for instance, today, the Russian Orthodox Church, numbering its 100 million, or more actually, I think they count 600 million. It's really big. And the Roman Catholic Church, they are technically just in schism. Now, they do have some theological disagreements, but neither of them has ever called the other a heretic. They would just say we are in schism. So it's an important distinction, but So I want to say, keep tracing things back, like kind of keep drawing these threads as we go along in history back to stuff in the scriptural times. Yeah, brother.
Would say the Benedictines and the Jesuits be in schism, or are they somehow differently defined as you have these various kinds of nunneries or monks?
Yeah.
And that
Yeah.
sense of the varieties of Catholicism in Catholicism.
Right. No, you wouldn't be right to say that they're in schism with each other. The various religious orderings function more like just sort of kind of clubs or guilds in-house. And so they have their different emphases and priorities and missions. But I've seen this happen. I'm friends with folks in the different orders. And, you know, if it's Mass, you could have a Jesuit and a Benedictine all at the altar if they're priests or at the rail together, no problemo. Now, they might have vigorous theological dispute on different things, but there's definitely not a schism. Schism would be revealed really these days, especially in Eucharistic fellowship. Like if you can take communion together, you're in communion, which would be the antonym of in schism. So good question. Partisanality, I think that's a word. Partisanship, there you go. Thanks. That's a better word. Partisanship is not new. So even in 1 Corinthians, look at what Paul writes. It's been reported to me by Chloe's people that there's quarreling among you, my brothers. What I mean is that each one of you says, I follow Paul, or I follow Apollos, or I follow Cephas, or I follow Christ, which is interesting. Is Christ divided? Was Paul crucified for you, or were you baptized in the name of Paul? And he goes on to make this big appeal for unity. So even right away in the church, there were groups in-house who were actually pretty much united by doctrine, but allying themselves with different leaders to try and to distinguish themselves. Right? That sort of club impulse, which has made, for instance, sometimes in the religious orders, if you study medieval church history, you know, the papacy and the Franciscans, you know, didn't get on well, and then the Jesuits became a problem. You know, there were these sort of like difficulties, but they began very early on. But schism as a formal thing, where you could clearly say, this group holds the right teaching, but they're of a different fellowship. It doesn't really exist in any way until the Novatians. And partly because the church is now big enough and self-defined enough, right, to kind of make a distinction between heresy and schism, structurally, that you're able to break away, right? If you're a group of 12 people, what's a breakaway? That's just someone left, right? A breakaway only happens with a larger organization. So we get this new specter of schism. And this actually then prompts sort of further definition of what it means to be Catholic. Prior to Novatian, it meant chiefly just about doctrine. But now, in the face of schism, it also meant to be united to the other people by communion fellowship, by a sort of structural bond. So what was, and again, this idea of unity based on a biblical principle, right? This wasn't sort of some brand new idea in the 3rd century, like, ooh, we should all be in fellowship with each other. I think that's important. New bylaw. You can tell I sit in a lot of board meetings. But the principle was from the Bible, from Jesus himself, right? John chapter 17, the famous prayer before Jesus goes to be killed. He prays like 5 or 6 times that they may be one, that they may be united. We are one, perfectly one. All this language about oneness was actually in the constitution of the church from the lips of Jesus, but took on sort of fresh shape in the 3rd century. So those are defining the terms. What was the schism about? I guess, do I have a slide? No. So let me go back actually. So what happened was, in times of persecution, they would set up these sort of tests to see if you really were a patriot to Rome or not. And the main one that they would do, because the marketplaces, just sort of at a level of city planning, were always around the local temple. And so when you read in Paul's letters about meat sacrificed to idols, it wasn't people like going into the temple to get some creepy meat. It was the market, like they were butchered at the altar of Artemis, and they're not just going to throw the meat away, like they sell it on the marketplace that was right outside the front door. So under a lot of excavations, you actually see sort of table cutouts in the sort of near foundations of temples where you could just have stuff on display. So in the marketplaces, which were also sort of in the shadow, literally, of the religious imperial sort of complex. They would set up sort of government employees would set up these stations where they'd have a little, statue of the emperor or something, and they would make citizens passing through. They would make you put a pinch of incense on the altar to the god, because if you're a true patriot, you wouldn't hesitate. You wouldn't hesitate. You know what I mean? Like, to use the Kaplan example, like a true patriot would take a knee. The true patriot would sprinkle the incense, and then thus you sort of showed, and it was kind of a cool way of being like, oh yeah, you bet, like community bonding, like we're all on the same page. And then Christians wouldn't, right? And they'd be like, no, I'm not going to. And then that was how you revealed yourself as, no, I'm not. And there was sort of this thing of, they would say, look, just a pinch of incense. And it's like, no, I'm not even going to give a pinch of incense. And so what would happen is then there was sort of another layer that was set up is, you don't go to the marketplace all the time. Maybe you avoid the marketplace. Who knows? There's other sort of government checkpoints, as it were. And people would carry sort of documents, and think about like in heavy states, like traveling in Hitler's Germany. You had to have a lot of documentation to travel. You had a document which said, I have in the past done a pinch of incense. Look. And I have honored the Roman gods. And you actually would have this, they were called libellati or something like that, these little pieces of paper. And you would kind of show these, and they were sort of like, I'm trying to think what a cultural analogy would be. Like, I mean, it's almost verging on like driver's license, where it's sort of like, this is how you know you belong. You got your little piece of paper. So then you also had a group of Christians who were like, well, I don't want to do a pinch of incense to a god in public, but maybe I can just pay a few bucks to a government guy I know, get one of those little stupid pieces of paper, and sort of like say I did, right? And that way, because when the persecution amped up, if you didn't have the piece of paper, if you wouldn't make the pinch of incense, you could get tortured and killed without trial, no jury. I mean, like, it was martial law for the Christians under Decius and Diocletian. So, as a matter of just saving your own skin, especially when you saw some guy like torn apart with the hooks, like a favorite Roman torture, like, a lot of Christians either did the pinch of incense or got the piece of paper. And then the sort of enforcement of the persecution would die down. And then those folk would want to come back to church, and you get people with like limbs missing and stuff. And then these people come back and like, well, we want to come back to church now. And there's a big question for all the pastors of, how do you handle that? You got people who've like lost family members, lost limbs, lost eyeballs. And then there's these sort of like fair weather Christians who are coming in and it's like, okay, you dodged when the going got hot, and now you just want to like join the fellowship. And because they were economically marginalized, Christian communities were economically self-connected. Like, it's like you kind of traded and took care of each other, and it was a real thick community. Think of like the Amish today or something. So it became this thing like, what do you do with these ones who have come back and who didn't suffer with the rest? And the Catholic answer was sort of emerged as a sort of pastoral consensus, of which Cyprian was sort of the loudest mouthpiece, because Carthage was the second city to Rome. It was kind of like the New Jersey to New York kind of thing, they would, or like, maybe that's a bad example, like a Philadelphia to a New York City in early America. So he had this sort of prominent place of leadership, and so and a lot of influence in Rome, and so his teaching sort of became, he was a real mouthpiece for consensus. And his thing was say, like, actually, ours is a religion of mercy. So you flubbed and you were a coward. You actually can come back in the church. Now, the definition of mercy in the 4th century was different than what we might think, right? We might say, okay, just, I don't know, say you're sorry and okay, you're back in, right? I mean, he made them do 10 years of penance. And for them, that meant architecturally, they had like the main body of the church, and then you had your kind of like forecourt, like a porch, basically. And that was where those who wanted to be Christians or those doing penance had to wait. And you couldn't receive communion. You couldn't partake in sort of like the festival dinners. You were like on the outside, and actually sometimes that was called the court of weepers. So his definition was that, if you stay there for 10 years and prove that you're earnest about coming back, in 7 to 10 years, we'll let you back in. And that was way too merciful for Novatian. I mean, again, if you read anything from the ancient world, everything was rougher and tougher and severer, I mean, than our, by comparison with all world history, we just live in like a pink pillow age. So I'm not saying the church should go back to that. I just mean, in the light of the cultural context, any Roman citizen would have gone, wow, Cyprian the Merciful. I mean, it doesn't sound like it to us, but it was for them. So Novation just said, like, if you denied Christ in the moment of testing, you could never come back in. And so he said, because you are too merciful, Cyprian, we are going to form a group of rigorous, we will never allow the lukewarm back in. We will be the elite. And so he created the Novatian Schism and had a handful of regional churches kind of following him for a while. And then there was sort of this back and forth appealing to the Bishop of Rome in terms of what his teaching was, and he sided with Cyprian. And so it's become church teaching to this day that, like, there is nothing on earth which you can do, which then is sort of the church will say there's no chance of forgiveness. Until you're dead, there's a chance of forgiveness, is what the church has always said. Or you should be given a chance for forgiveness. So that's what Novation breaks over. So I should have had a slide about that. So Novation and his followers, because they have made this elite group and are actually then going against the sort of pastoral consensus, Cyprian actually, he didn't make this decision by himself. He called a handful of local councils and consulted with a lot of other bishops and said, how do you handle this? What have the outcomes been? And they actually really reached that through in a very good way. When Novation wouldn't go along with the sort of what had become the Catholic pastoral discipline of mercy, the church then said, look, if you're going to like self-segregate as some sort of so-called elitists, then you have isolated yourself, and we will ratify it. You're out. If you can't get along with a religion that practices mercy, you are excommunicated. So the Novatians were excommunicated, not for anything they believed wrongly, but because of their pastoral, their application and their practice. What's interesting, because of this excommunication was in defense of mercy, what we see over the next 100 years is popes and the bishops of Carthage, where these churches were Novation, every like 15 or so years saying, do you guys want to change your minds and come back? And the Novation said, nope. So they persisted until into the 5th century, and then they just disappear. And it's interesting that rigorism just died out. And what's interesting is you'll always see sort of throughout church history these sort of ultra-rigorist movements. And they're a flash in the pan. Consequences, which isn't, let me say this, which isn't to say that I don't think Catholic Christianity is rigorous. It's absolutely rigorous. But if out of sort of a fleshly love for like die-hard rigor, remember what one of the marks of sort of false teaching is to go beyond the letter, right, to push it too far. One of the dangers in studying sort of church history according to its big movements and ideas is to sort of lose sight of just the normal life in the church as well. So what I want to say is, while rigorists are troubling North Africa, while persecutions are popping up here and there, sort of as a sort of, what's that called in music, where you have organum in the old medieval music, where you have like a low note of music under which like the melody kind of sings in like early polyphony, right? I think that's right. Hopefully there's no music professors here who can correct me on that. But anyways, there's an organum here of sort of normal Christian life. The church continues preaching, and there's missions into new lands. The gospel goes up into what we now call Armenia and Georgia. Interesting historical fact, the first nation for the leader of the nation to say, we are a Christian nation ever, was Armenia, not Rome. It was in the 3rd century. So missions sort of, remember, Christianity began in Jerusalem, spreads out through the Mediterranean. It continues to spread further east, further north, up into, you look at Bede's history of the church in England, up into northern England. You see the church spreading. Continued relief of the poor. That part of the daily practice of the church is still to care for the ones for whom sort of rigid, stoic Roman society could care less for, like the crippled and children. And remember, again, we have to recreate a thick backdrop. It was still legal and actually perfectly permissible to just expose a child if you didn't want it. I mean, like, take a newborn baby and put it on, leave it out in the woods and just walk away. Like, no penalty for that. So it was the church who would then go and rescue these abandoned children, right? They'd hold local councils to attend to local issues. These were the first synods, which we're going to see play a major part in later centuries. Continue to fight Gnostic heresies within and without. Continue to worship faithfully underground. And the church not only survives episodes of brutal persecution, but continues to grow. When we look at it's very hard to put together population, like numbers of adherents in this age, because the demographic data is just slim. But it seems to be continual growth. We never see the church kind of go, it's like, I mean, it might stagnate for a bit, and people kind of wander in persecution, but it just keeps growing. Yeah.
Is there an evolution of the liturgy during this time?
Yeah, good.
Or what is the Mass actually?
Good question, yeah. Okay, so let me think of a good way to answer that. Yes, it evolves in formality and sort of established pieces where once maybe they said, just say a free-form prayer here, they would become like, oh, this is the prayer that Polycarp used to pray, let's pray that one, you know. But they were still pretty flexible and it would still differ quite a lot regionally, even though it would have some of the same structure. It would still be centered along, so the liturgy, actually we have time, which is great. So the liturgy in the early church right away is a conglomeration of two things. The synagogue worship inherited from the Jews, which is listening to the scriptures and then praying psalms. And then this thing that the founder of the church said, do this all the time, communion. So they would read the scriptures, pray psalms, and then celebrate this meal with bread and wine. And then we see Justin Martyr in the 2nd century describing a liturgy, and he talks about that exact structure of like everyone gathered on the Lord's Day, we heard the Holy Scriptures read, we sang some hymns, and then the bishop got up and he said a prayer of thanksgiving to God for his work in Jesus, and then said the words of institution. He mentions that, this is my body, this is my blood, and then he distributes the bread and the wine. So you see the shape of communion already in place by the early 2nd century. But then it does, you know, Justin Martyr says, I think at one point in that description he says, and then the bishop just prays as long a prayer as he can about everything he can think of, which I love. So now, you know, liturgies, we've got all these set prayers, and so they were a bit less established, we know. But yeah, Bill. Yeah. So Gnostic as a technical term, meaning someone who believes in two gods, one of whom's lesser and evil. I mean, like those sort of things that define Gnostic. That would be from the vantage point of Christianity, inherently false and, you know, you just say evil. I mean, it would be rejected out of hand as a technical thing. Just to claim to have knowledge in a sort of non-technical sense, of course, is not heresy. In fact, one of the things I mentioned last time is Clement of Alexandria actually trying to reappropriate that word and say, no, we Catholic Christians are the true Gnostics. We truly know. But he's actually fighting against sort of the ascending normal meaning of that word, which was the standard sort of pieces of Gnostic theology. So yeah, especially when we're talking in the 3rd century, the word Gnostic is always not an in-house friendly word at that point, yeah.
You made reference to innovation in North Africa, so it never really caught on like elsewhere around the empire?
No, it did in Italy, around Rome. There was some novation. In Rome, there were churches that sided with the Bishop of Rome and with Cyprian, and then there were those who sided with novation. So yeah, because there's just a little bit of sea disconnecting, North Africa and from Italy. And so it was confined mostly to North Africa and then some in Italy. I don't think it went further than those two regions. What's interesting is North Africa, as we're going to see in future lectures, seems to have a penchant for severity. We'll see that again with the Donatists in a century's time. But what was I saying? The liturgy. Yeah. So liturgy does develop. I think it's not really until when we think of the liturgy today, it's incorporated a number of elements that come from the sort of rituals of the Roman Empire. In terms of the vestments and processions, those were all part of empire ritual, which then they were wicked while the empire worshipped other gods intentionally. When the empire becomes Christian under Constantine, the symbols get made progressively more benign. But we see it interestingly coming in with grades. For instance, incense doesn't seem to be used in the church until the 5th century because it was just so associated with pagan idols. Whereas senatorial vestments, if you go to Catholic Mass and you see the priest wear a chasuble, that is an outer garment of the ruling class of late antique Rome. That's it. But it became, it sort of, fashion changed, but the church kept it. Anyways, so there's interesting liturgical stuff. So yeah, worship. So I want to say about underground. How many of you have heard of the catacombs in Rome? Any of you ever been to the catacombs in Rome? Wow, I'm so envious of you who've gone to go. So you've been, if there's anything, I'm sure, I've not been. I'm just constructing this from books. If there's other stuff that you want to chip in, I would love to hear that. So if you go to Rome, there's miles and miles of tunnels dug for burials in the city of Rome, and they're called the catacombs. And that was property which Romans didn't want to go to. Like, who wants to hang out in, basically a long, poorly ventilated mausoleum? So the Christians, when they needed a place to go to worship, and they knew that, like, if you got seen as a Christian, it's just a matter of years before some new empire comes and another persecution is going to come, they laid pretty low, especially during times of persecution. So these are some pictures, and the estimates of how many Christians are buried here is in the hundreds of thousands. I mean, there's just miles. I forget how many miles there are, but aren't there like 40 miles or something of tunnels? Like, just so, several layers, like a subway. Like the subways are at different levels. Like, just all these layers. And these are nooks for bodies, where you would put a body, seal it up with like dirt and a waxy kind of clay substance. It would decompose and be, by all the bugs and stuff, to just bones in a few years. But bodies were placed in here, and there were these sort of venting holes and things for light and air, so otherwise it would be impossibly putrid. But it still would have been stinky. I mean, it would not have been a pleasant, but I forget where I read it, but I think it was some primary text of like, I mean, this is really gross, but like the juices like seeping out of these things. I mean, like, yeah. So, I mean, but I'd say it's pretty gnarly. Like, this looks kind of nice, like, ooh, cool. Like, but no, it was pretty gnarly. So these are from catacombs. What they would do is then, so this is a tomb. So these are like tomb holes. So you put a body. And then this was one where an elder, a bishop who had been martyred, would have been buried in like a place of honor in this like burial ground. And then it became a Eucharistic table to celebrate with bread and wine and have your liturgy. Look at this. They've actually decorated here with pillars. Actually, I don't know when these were added. Those look like later additions. But we see this sort of vaulting and this sort of creating worship space, which out of and around the bodies of the dead, which you could only do in a religion where you believed in the resurrection, where if you believed that death was sort of just the end, it would be very creepy to gather down here. But it still probably was a bit creepy. But if you believed that at some point, the God-man was going to appear again in the sky, and this guy who's lying in this tomb is going to wake up and be transformed to never die again, like, there's like a hook. I mean, the Christianity has always been a religion of hope, of the resurrection. And so we think of resurrection in such sort of dry, Platonic spiritual terms. To think of these early church writers writing in this context, it's like, for them, resurrection was this earthy, real, like this rotting, smelly body, God is going to raise up to be beautiful and glorious. Like, this was an epic reminder of these things. We get these, again, sort of vaults where these would have been bodies buried in here, and the Eucharist was celebrated. We see the earliest Christian art on the walls, on the ceilings and walls of these catacombs. Figural images from the Old Testament that are types of the life of Christ. Early pictures. Here we go. So, taking Old Testament imagery about the sacrifices of bulls and oxen, and then a bull like bowing its neck, like all these rich biblical imageries which reveal the deep biblical knowledge of the people. This is Jacob and his well. And again, so it's like these are figures, right? They're worshiping Jesus, not Jacob, but they're drawing pictures of Old Testament scenes to sort of the highlight by way of typology, pointing forward to Christ, who would find his bride at the well. They interpret it as the waters of baptism. These deep, kind of layered ways of reading the Old Testament. So we see, figures. This. Here we go. See this picture up top here? You see where the pointer is? It's one of the earliest pictures of Jesus. And you see the Greek letters, Alpha, Omega. See a halo. So someone was asking about the age of Jesus. I mean, we see, so you get here's a very, very early picture of Jesus. And then, so not all catacomb art is the same in terms of era. Who asked the question? Oh, yeah. I don't know exactly. I would wager this one is not the earliest. I think this is probably late 3rd century, maybe like early 4th century. Like, I'm not sure. There is some catacomb art earlier, but I think this is a bit later. It could even be a bit later than that. Let me try and find out for you next time. So, and then these are stars. They would kind of create this idea of like sort of cosmos in the space that you're like worshiping in sort of a mini cosmos. So those are pictures of the catacombs. I want to read an excerpt for you from a fictional book by a guy named Mark Halter, which sort of brings together some of the things we talked about today, both the sort of the setting for worship and the development of the creed and kind of how bonded the early church was. So I've not read this book. This was just a quote that actually my dad handed to me incidentally a few years ago. And I was like, wow, like what a great picture. So the scene is, you just need to know the names of two characters. Absalom, so it's set sort of in the late second, when is this? Yeah, I think it was set in the late second, early third century. There's this guy named Absalom, and he finds out his daughter has been hanging out with the Christians, and he himself is a Jew. And so he follows her one night to the catacombs where the Christians are meeting, and he meets up with his son, Adar. So we've got Abraham, the dad, Adar, the son, and they followed the daughter, Arsinoe, to these catacombs. "Things are going well," whispered Adar. "We have the password. Follow me to the entrance." "But what is the password?" Absalom asked impatiently. "The question is, who are you?" And the answer is, "I am your brother." "Did you hear that yourself?" "No, Abner heard it, but I've tried it." Absalom was comforted by a sense of brotherhood as he looked at the young man's eyes shining in the darkness. They went to the entrance of the catacombs and waited for someone to come. Adar had extinguished his lantern. The night air was heavy with the fragrance of flowers and grass. Finally, 3 silhouettes appeared. Absalom touched his son's arm. They followed the newcomers through a cemetery flanked by 2 rows of cypress trees that were like high black flames in the blue of the night. Then they stopped in front of a doorway so narrow that only one person could go through at a time. 2 men were standing there in the faint glow of a shaded lantern. It was impossible to avoid them. "Who are you?" one of them asked Absalom softly. "I am your brother," replied Absalom. The man gave his arm a friendly squeeze and let him pass. "Who are you?" the other man asked Adar. Adar was dying of fear. He had an impulse to run away, run home, shut himself up in his room and go to sleep. "Who are you?" repeated the voice, more insistently this time. "I'm his son," said Adar, pointing to Absalom's back. "You don't know the password?" Adar tried to collect his wits. "The password? I am your brother," he said. He was allowed to go in behind Absalom. They walked along a passageway lighted by smoking torches thrust into a wall at distinct intervals. Burial chambers had been dug into the soft rock on either side of the passageway, and they went through rooms containing rows of sarcophagi and tombstones. They heard the gathering before they saw it. It was being held in a room larger than the others and more brightly lit. There were about 100 people present, men, women, and children, and the walls were decorated with vivid paintings that showed a man undergoing martyrdom or a lamb in front of a cross. One sign, the image of a fish, was repeated so often that Absalom wondered if it was the emblem of the sect. A man in a white robe stood facing the gathering. "Do you renounce sin?" he asked. "I renounce it," the gathering replied in unison. "Do you renounce that which leads to evil?" "I renounce it." "Do you believe in the Almighty Father, creator of heaven and earth?" "I believe." "Do you believe in Jesus Christ, his only Son, our Lord, who suffered the passion, was buried, arose from the dead, and sits at the right hand of the Father?" "I believe." "Do you believe in the forgiveness of sin?" I've only got 1 more minute. "The resurrection of the flesh and eternal life?" "I believe." Absalom tried to recognize his daughter among the worshippers and distinguish her voice among those that resounded beneath the vaulted stone ceiling. Bread and wine were brought in. The congregation stood up. The man in white said loudly, "On the night of his betrayal, when he was about to enter freely into his passion, Jesus took bread, gave thanks for it, broke it, and gave it to his disciples, saying, 'Take this and eat. It is my body, which is broken for you.' At the end of the meal, he took a cup, and again he gave thanks. He gave the cup to his disciples and said, 'Take this and drink of it, all of you. This is my blood, the blood of the new and eternal covenant, which will be poured out for you and the multitude for the remission of sin. Do this in remembrance of me.'" The bread and wine were served to the congregation. Absalom was sensitive to the fervor and solemnity of the moment, but he was filled with horror at the thought that his daughter might be practicing this rite. The man in white now said, "By him, with him, and in him, to you, God, the Father Almighty, in the unity of the Holy Spirit, all honor and glory, world without end. Amen," boomed the congregation. Adar tugged at his father's arm and discreetly pointed to the corner of the room where those distributing the bread and wine had just arrived. Faces were being raised and hands outstretched. "Arsinoe," Absalom suddenly cried out. "Arsinoe, it's I, your father." Everyone turned to him. He quickly found himself surrounded by several determined-looking men. Should he fight? He remembered how he and his ancestors had fought against the Greeks in Alexandria. "I'm that girl's father," he said. "I've come to take her away. And he called to her again, Arsinoe. The man in white, who was evidently the leader of the congregation, came over to Absalom. He had deep-set eyes and 2 furrows on each side of his mouth. Arsinoe is dead. Mary has been born. We have baptized her, and she has received the new life of the children of God. Absalom and Addo were pushed outside without having been able to approach Arsinoe. When he returned home, Absalom began the rite of Shiva, as if his daughter actually was dead. After 7 days of mourning, he resumed his work, but he was never the same again. So I leave you with that image, and we'll pick up next week.